By the time 1978 rolled around, what was once a personal luxury coupe was now the largest vehicle in Oldsmobile's lineup. And remember that General Motors had downsized the Oldsmobile as well as other full-size vehicles for the 1977 model year, and then the intermediates were downsized for the 1978 model year, leaving the Toronado to be the large and the last of the big rockets, let's just say. And this was a large and in-charge car, measuring 227.5 inches in overall length and riding atop 122-inch wheelbase. It was about 7 or 8 inches longer than the Olds 98 of the same year, just to give you a sense of comparison between this and the full-size four-door car. So here you have a massive two-door from yesteryear that was first introduced on this particular platform in 1971, the second generation Olds Toronado. And here you have it in its ultimate year, 1978. Now, the 1978 Toronado can be easily distinguished in this view from the 1977 model because the grille has a vertically textured theme as opposed to an egg crate theme. So if you're wondering how to discern the 77 from the 78, that's, at least I think, one of the easiest ways to see that. And we can see a number of things from this particular vantage point on the 78 Toronado. It still has a number of styling themes from when the car was first introduced in 1971, although I much prefer, admittedly, the 71 styling. That was in the days before the bumper standards. And I love the little twin grille theme that they had on the left and right up front. Of course, that was disbanded due to the supersized or relatively supersized bumper that you have here on this 78 model. But the car still does have a number of features from the 71, namely that character line on the quarter panel that runs up vertically and then goes horizontally all the way to the rear of the vehicle. And you can see it here accentuated by the pinstriping. That line is actually identical, well, I shouldn't say identical, but nearly identical to the 1967 to 70 Eldorado that also had a similar character line on the quarter panel. You also have a character line that starts at the front of the fender and then runs all the way back and kind of terminates partway through the door there that you can see it dives down at a 45-degree angle. That was something that was a feature on the 71 Toronado, the second-gen Toronado, when it was introduced, and it continued on here through the styling. I suspect because this car uses the same door as that 71. They never really redid the A-pillars or the glass on these vehicles, although they did redo the front ends and the rear ends, especially as I mentioned, the bumper standards were put into place. And as we transition to the front view here, you can see a number of features, a very vertical theme there with the fenders. But there's also something interesting about this front end, and that is that this vehicle, the Toronado, didn't really espouse the Oldsmobile twin port grille theme that was introduced on other Oldsmobiles in 1968. Here, clearly, there's no separation between the grille. It's just one piece in the middle there. And if you're wondering what those little slots are in the bumper, the vertical slots underneath the headlights, well, those are for the bumper jack. It would hook in there. It was a modification of earlier bumper-style jacks to allegedly make it safer. You'd hook it in and you'd jack the car up at that point. The only downside was they often damaged the bumper to some degree because these cars were so heavy and, well, you know, you could fix your flat, but you also often put a little bit of a scar in the bumper in doing so. Now, one thing I must say is a bit disappointing about this Toronado is that it still has a little bit of that coffin nose up front, but it kind of lost the overall styling theme because of the bumper. That coffin nose theme was pretty well blunted by it. And it really, to my eye, just kind of, well, doesn't allow the car to complete the styling that the designers originally wanted. And it's even more unfortunate as we turn around to the rear, you're going to see a similar analogous form on the deck lid, but it's more accentuated on the deck lid than it is up front. And I think the car just looks a bit incongruent as a consequence when you compare that to how congruent the front and rear were on the early second-generation Tornados. Now, turning to this rear three-quarter view, you can see what I mean. This deck lid has this pronounced kind of coffin shape in the rear that actually continues on into the bumper, which helps accentuate it, whereas on the front, That's not true. So kind of an unfortunate, let's say, element associated with the styling of these later second-gen Torenados. I do like the rear. Again, you can see this car went with this vertical theme with the termination of the rear quarter panel and what appear to be Cadillac-style tail lamps that are perfectly vertical, just like Cadillacs of the era. Of course, you can see here that the principal lamp was the horizontal lamp, for whatever reason divided into three out back here. Of course, the Toronado 471 would introduce the high-mounted stop lamps above the deck lid underneath the backlight. And that was not the first domestic car to have that, but it was, I believe, the first domestic General Motors vehicle to have those high-mounted stop lamps that supplemented the regular lamps that you can see underneath the deck lid. Now, one feature I'm not crazy about is that you can see that the quarter panel here ends, and then there is an area between that and the bumper, and that has a bumper filler. And these are the dreaded General Motors bumper fillers of the era that are often cracked and missing, and then the car just looks weird and bizarre, and something that you really have to watch out if you buy one of these vehicles. Ideally, you want one where those bumper fillers have been replaced, and if not, they better be in gosh darn good shape, and you better keep the car in a climate-controlled garage, and don't let anybody squeeze your bumper fillers because they are most definitely fragile in this year, 2025, after this car's production in 1978. And as we take a look at the dead-on rear view, you can see those high-mounted stop lamps there that are right underneath the backlight. There's a lot of lamps on the rear of this car. I guess that the person behind you should at least know what's happening. And you can also see, by the way, those hooks in the rear bumper that serve the same purpose as what I mentioned for the front of the vehicle. You can also see a bit of why I don't necessarily care for this generation Toronado, because between the bumper filler and how that mates up with the quarter panel and how the filler's made up with the tail lamps and the bumper, it just looks sloppy, when you look at this car from the dead-on rear. And they frankly looked kind of sloppy even new. Of course, as the vehicle ages, it's not going to get better with age, generally speaking. But I have to say, even the mint condition Torenados from this era and Eldorados and things with these big bumper fillers, they just didn't quite look like they were all that well put together. And it's unfortunate because I think the styling's actually quite handsome, but, the execution was what it was. And now as we turn to the inside, this is where this particular car, I think, shines, because this Toronado is not only black exterior, but also black interior. So black on black, and you get these full loose cushion style seats that really were patterned off of the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regency seats, just immensely padded on the top and the bottom. They're actually not all that comfortable. Sometimes these paddings really just don't have the right firmness. They're a little too firm in some places, and they push on you in a bit of the wrong spot, but I still say that they're more comfortable than a lot of modern vehicle seats, which for whatever reason just stink more often than not. It's just annoying. Should be able to design better seats these days, but it seems like that's something that OEMs have trouble doing. Now, as we turn to the front of the passenger compartment, specifically the driver's area here, you'll notice a few things. One is the flat floor, of course, because the Toronado is front-wheel drive. So you don't have the transmission hump, the drive shaft, anything like that. And it enables a perfectly flat floor for one to sit on. Great for those middle seat passengers. Of course, you also notice the supersized Oldsmobile accelerator pedal. I think Oldsmobile had the largest accelerator pedals of any General Motors division. I think the 60s era Oldsmobile accelerator pedals are a little bit bigger than the 70s era, but they are massive nonetheless. Yes, other GM divisions did have big accelerators, but, I think Oldsmobile had to have the biggest one. And it's a floating pedal, by the way. It's not hinged at the bottom. So it's kind of nice and comfortable to drive on. I don't know why Chrysler and Ford, by this point, didn't have the supersized accelerators. Chrysler definitely had some before this, but it's kind of neat. And, of course, a massive brake pedal as well. Now, the dash design here was redone for the 1974 model year, and they messed around with the faux wood grain. I think it actually looks quite tasteful by this point in time. And it's not really the driver-centric cockpit that the 71, 2, and 3 had. It's got a little bit of a driver-centric theme to it, but very, very minor. I do think it's a pretty handsome panel. I love the glove box with the mid-century modern Oldsmobile block lettering on it. Of course, here you have the digital clock, which was all the rage at this point in time. And you can see the crotch cooler vents there for the air conditioning on the lower portion of the dash, something that you don't see anymore. And, well, if you didn't like them, you could just turn them off. But I thought it was nice. It also helped with in-cabin air distribution. Speaking of which, here's the climate control panel in this 78 Toronado. And you'll notice that it has automatic temperature. It's kind of hard to read. It says Temp-matic there to the right of the 80 degrees Fahrenheit marking. But this just had automatic temperature control that was controlling the outlet temperature of the air. But you can see that you manually controlled the mode up with the top slider and the fan speed. So this was not Comfortron, which was fully automatic air conditioning. This was kind of semi-automatic. I'm not quite sure why Olds went with this approach, if this was something that was customer-driven or was a cost savings. But I suspect that a lot of people kind of complained about true automatic temperature control, and they wanted to control the fan speed and where the air came out. So this was probably a win from a cost perspective and also a win from a customer perspective. Now, the engine in the 78 Toronado was the Olds 403 cubic inch small block V8. And why am I showing you a picture of this? Because this is kind of cropped from a Toronado. I don't know what somebody was doing with it, but I thought it was interesting because you can actually see the engine, and the radiator is at the far background of the picture here. And in the foreground is the transmission, the turbohydromatic 425 transmission, along with the transmission mount. But notice the torque converter is coupled to the rear of the engine. And then there's a Morse high-volt chain that basically takes the output from the torque converter and then uses that output from the torque converter to drive the rest of the transmission, which is pointing forward toward the radiator. And that's really what makes this setup so unique. The turbohydromatic 425 transmission was effectively a turbohydromatic 400 that was kind of split in half after the torque converter with a Morse high-volt chain to drive the rest of the transmission. Now, the 403 was only produced from 1977 to 1979, and of course it made its way into the Toronado in 1978, as we just talked about. It also made its way into other General Motors vehicles that were not Oldsmobiles. This was during a time when General Motors started sharing engines across divisions, and in the Buick as well as the Oldsmobile and the Pontiac, there was the Pontiac 301, the Buick 350, and the Olds 403 were often engines that you could get in the Buick Olds Pontiac lineup, let's say from 1977, 78-ish, as GM tried to consolidate engines. The Olds 455 was sunset after the 1976 model year. The 403 was the top engine. And it was an okay engine, I would say. It has windowed main bearing webs, so the lower end isn't all that strong. It does have Siamese cylinder walls, so some people used to complain of overheating. Very over-square design, like 4.3 plus inch bore by a 3.385 inch stroke, I want to say. So an inch difference between the bore and the stroke. And like I said, the 403 was a small block engine based on the smaller Oldsmobile V8, not the big block that the 455, as an example, was based on. If you drive them normally, they're just fine. They're pretty peppy. This Toronado is a heavy car, though, and I would say the 403 definitely did better in the downsized, full-size vehicles like the Olds 88s and 98s. But still, overall, not a bad engine. The turbohydromatic 425 was a good transmission. The Olds 403 and turbohydromatic 425 were, in fact, used in 1978 still in the GMC motorhomes. So they were, overall, generally, the transmission was excellent, I would say. The engine was not bad, not great. The 455 was definitely better. So if you get a Toronado, I'd recommend getting one from 1976 or before. You want that Olds 455. Get that 455 under hood. So what do you think about this 1978 Oldsmobile Toronado that I just showed? Drop a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.